Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Studium Generale, the platform for knowledge and reflection of the Utrecht University. My name is Laura Mol. I work for Studium Generale, and for those of you who are not familiar with our work, we organize all kinds of lectures, talk shows. We also organize Bedweter Festival. We produce a lot of online content, so if you want to stay updated, you can follow us on social media or subscribe to our newsletter. We are always looking to improve our events, so at the end of the night, I will show you a QR code on the screens here, and it would be really great if you could scan that and take about 3 minutes to give your opinion on, what do you think of the night? What can we do better? We'd highly appreciate it. All of our events are live streamed as well and can be viewed on demand. So for everyone at home watching, a warm welcome to you as well. Know that you can put your questions in the chat and that my coworker Esther will send them to me on my phone. Also for you guys, you can also ask your questions later in the evening. Tonight's event falls within the lecture series War and Peace, which is also a collaboration with SIP, so everyone from SIP, welcome as well. Today we will be discussing a question that has probably been on everyone's mind at some point in their lives, a question that has been on my mind ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, and has been even more prominent after this weekend, after the horrific scenes of violence in Israel and later also in Gaza. It seems easy to start a war, but how can we end one? It's a question that we will try to answer today with the help of two experts. We have international peace negotiator Fleur Ravensbergen, who will join us later in the evening for the discussion part. But we will start with a lecture by Simeon Paravantes. And he's an historian of war at the Utrecht University. He studies how wars begin, how they're conducted, and how they end. To do so, he studies war tactics, political debates, rivalries, and supply chains. His research focuses on the proxy wars of the Cold War, the origins of the US-Soviet rivalry, how the rivalry evolved over time, the conflicts that erupted in the wake of the collapse of the USSR, and the issue of reparations. Tonight he will give us an introduction on war and peace in the past and how we can end wars and prevent wars in the present and the future. Please welcome Dr. Simeon Paravantes. Don't forget to turn on the mic.
Good evening. Well, thank you, Laura, very much for that introduction. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And it is a shame that tonight, while I'm talking as a historian, these things are taking place in real time. So let's keep that in mind. I've entitled my talk, Wars, Prevention, Inceptions, and Ends, in the hope of providing an overview about what these things really are from a historical perspective. And my background, my training, is in diplomatic history. What does that mean? It means that to try and understand these things, I use the diplomatic record. I'm looking at these events not in the contemporary period, but in the past, 40, 50, 60, 70 years removed from when these events took place, when the papers have been declassified. And what that allows me to do is to get into the mindset of the decision makers as they're in periods of crisis, dealing with war, dealing with rapidly changing situations on the ground. And I'm trying to understand how they make decisions, how they process information, how they evaluate threat, and how they plan for the future. And with that, I also have borrowed techniques from economic and social history, looking at domestic economies in wartime. How does this affect supply chains? How does this affect the production of war material? And what effects does that have on society? These are important questions. So tonight, I'm going to proceed thematically in 4 parts. I'll give a brief introduction and historical background, and then talk about some of the theories and the practices that have been attempted in the past to prevent war. I'm then going to talk about war itself. Once these things have failed and war has erupted, what does it look like? What can we expect? And finally, to talk a little bit about the relationship between war and peace. How do we get to a point when the war stops, when the shooting stops, to prevent it from happening again? And perhaps from a historical perspective can give us a few insights. And there's a few general things I would like to say before beginning. Tonight I'm going to be talking a lot about the West, but I'd like to point out that this is not a geographical descriptor. This is an institutions and value-based descriptor. And so countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are Western, but they're not European. Russia is European, but it is not Western. And often the West is referred to as the West by those outside of it. So this is an important term in my field. Now finally, about history, I'd like to stress that it's not predictive. Okay, it's not about predicting the future, but it can be informative to help us understand the world in which we're living right now. So it's not about what will happen, but rather, if this occurs, then this may result. We can speculate. But it also is a sensitivity. History is a sensitivity that explains to us that the world will not remain as it is, that things will change. And it puts us in touch with our past, both the beautiful parts and the horrific parts, understanding what those have come before us have gone through to get us here. And it follows the evidence wherever it leads. A proper training in history will allow you the comfort and the confidence to change your mind when you're presented with new evidence. And it also helps to reconcile things that appear contradictory, at least superficially. How can two or three things be true at the same time? Well, perhaps a historical understanding can help us do that. For example, when we're talking about war is illegal, but they still happen. Does the one cancel out the other, or is there a way to reconcile these two things? So why study war? And I'm going to borrow the words of Margaret Macmillan, a historian I greatly admire, saying, as a historian, I firmly believe that we have to include war in our study of human history if we are to make any sense of the past. War's effects have been so profound that to leave it out is to ignore one of the great forces which have shaped human development and changed history, for good or ill, I might add. So dealing with this, there have been many theories, many practices put in place to try and prevent these things from happening. And so, can war be prevented? Well, I hope that everything that I talk about tonight, we reflect on this as I go through the lecture. Because before I can answer that question, or even try to give you something resembling an answer, we need to know what it is, the long-term effects, the cost that it bears, and why states still resort to war. And it's important as well to note that prior to World War I, prior to the 19th century especially, war was seen as a legitimate aspect of a state's foreign policy. It was a legitimate tool of statecraft. You would want a little bit of territory, you would fight for a while, a number of poor people would die, and then you would stop because the cost had gotten too high, you might have lost some territory, maybe you gained some, but that was it. World War I changes that. Actually, the American Civil War really starts to change that, when we see the first total war of the modern period, where a state's entire resources are dedicated to this, and huge casualties result. The American Civil War is really a foreshadowing what's to come. And when World War I comes, with its 20 million dead, Germany is blamed, but so too is the Kaiser. He's forced to abdicate. And we see a shift that's transforming from state responsibility to war to an individual responsibility. This shift occurs after World War I. We're going to start holding individuals responsible for these things. And the legacy of World War I is so great that in 1928, war is outlawed through the Kellogg-Briand Pact. But yet, what happens? World War II. It's illegal, and World War II happens, where 3% of the world's population at the time dies. Up to 80 million people by some estimates. These are incredible statistics, but this is what the risk is when a great power, as they like to say in international relations, or an interstate war, as they like to say in international law, occurs. When the entire resource of a state is transformed to support a war effort. Well, this is what happens in the modern era. After this occurs, Germany is blamed, but the individual perpetrators are tried at Nuremberg. Many of them are executed for their crimes. Many serve long prison sentences. The UN Charter, signed shortly before Nuremberg, says that it's primary reason for existence is to protect succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And if we jump further ahead in time, the ICC is founded to hold individuals accountable for these crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and 6 years ago, finally, the crime of aggression. An unprovoked attack on your neighbor, and now individuals can be prosecuted. So we'd think, what a progress. And it is a progress. But let me back up for a moment, because it wasn't the ICC in existence during the Cold War that preserved this peace, that prevented another great power war from happening. It was MAD, mutually assured destruction, and the resulting treaties. Both powers knew that if they were to get into a direct conflict with each other, and we know this now from the diplomatic record, that the earth would be turned to cinders. That had a great calming effect when things got too hot. It didn't mean there was no conflict, but at least between the two superpowers, there was no direct conflict. And there were large treaties signed to try and prevent these things from happening. And in addition, the veto in the UN Security Council also seemed to have a calming effect on these interstate relations, not needing to resort to war with each other because they could veto each other in the UN. So it seemed that that also played a role in preserving at least the peace between the great powers. And so this Cold War was successful, and arguably has been successful until the recent past. And when I was a grad student, it was not that long ago, but a while ago, it was very trendy to say, oh, the Cold War, what a shame. But I was always mystified by that, because the alternative to a Cold War is a hot war. And we know the price of a hot war. We're seeing those images right now. And so for me, rather than lamenting the fact that the Cold War was there, it was about giving credit that the Cold War took place, that the Truman administration on one side and that the Soviet administration on the other had safeguards put in place. It doesn't mean that there were no mistakes, and let's not get too altruistic here. We're not in a land of sunshine and rainbows. But at least there was something there that they understood what the cost of a conflict between the two of them would be. And so the next thing then, so when we're looking about these theories of deterrence, preventing war, what role do armed forces play? Because certainly they also play a role. And in military theory, there's a number of overriding ideas, one of which is, well, you hope that having an army will prevent your neighbor from attacking you, from threatening you. You also hope that your army may give you a stronger voice in negotiations. And this is direct from military theory, where I've pulled this. You must have, the belief is, you must have a significantly stronger military than your opponent. Your military, in combination with your allies, must have a huge variety of capabilities, and you must communicate that to your opponents so that they have no desire to attack you whatsoever. I'm not saying I subscribe to this. I'm just saying that this is one of the predominant theories that are in existence, especially in the US, with maintaining large military forces. Now, what about then conferences to avoid war? One of the lesser known, at Genoa, 1923, launched by the British to try and revisit the terms of Versailles. Versailles has been widely criticized for a number of reasons, one of which was just its isolation of Germany. And the British very quickly realized that Europe with an isolated Germany was not safe, and worked very quickly, unsuccessfully as it turned out, but to try and reevaluate the terms of the treaty to reintegrate Germany, to prevent it from going its own way. We also had Munich. Munich was a conference. Now, Munich was maligned as the great failure of not standing up to the bullies. But this is a misreading of history. It's a misreading and not being historicist in our views, not understanding the world as it existed in 1938 for those people. Many of those people at Munich, Chamberlain and his cabinet included, had lived through the First World War. They knew the price, and they were doing everything that they could to prevent it from happening again. And indeed, recent historiography has started vindicating Chamberlain and his group. Not for succeeding, obviously they did not, but for the attempt. The attempt at peace fortified the British public, knowing that the government had done all that they could to avoid war. When war finally came, the British public were ready. So there's something to be said for that. And even more recently, Macron, when he went just prior to the invasion, trying to find a way out, He was maligned in many media sources that Putin had played him. But at the same time, should we not at least take every opportunity to pursue peace if there's the slimmest chance? So in my opinion, he should not be maligned for that. Maybe it was naive, but we should still pursue all these opportunities when they present themselves. And if a conference doesn't work, if your armed force doesn't work, well, there are other policies. You can try and integrate rivals into a mutually beneficial relationship that rewards cooperation and punishes deviation. We had Wandel durch Handel for the last 20 years in Europe, transformation through trade, Germany's policy towards Russia, designed to integrate Russia into the West, to prevent it, to make sure that there would be too many economic and social ties for war to be an acceptable option. Based in modernization theory, this was Germany's approach to Russia and the United States' approach to China, that as ties increased and as these countries developed a middle class and wealth, that they would demand political liberalization, and that from this, authoritarianism would give way to liberalism. That was the idea. And the invasion in February 22 saw that policy blow up in their faces. But that was an idea as well. So what about sanctions? We've heard a lot about sanctions recently. They have been tried before to prevent or end wars. Two of the most notable examples, Italy, when it invaded Ethiopia, was slapped with an arms embargo and an oil embargo by the League of Nations. But hampered by an inability to enforce these sanctions, they were little more than a symbol. And oil embargo placed against Japan by the United States prior to World War II, well, if anything, that drove Japan to attack the Americans sooner, thinking that the time is now or never. So when these things fail, when you don't have a big enough armed force to deter, when the conference doesn't work, your policies have blown up in your face and sanctions aren't having the desired effect, and war begins, what does it look like? What is it? Well, I'd like to put this in your minds. War is miscalculation. You miscalculate how your opponent will react, how well they'll resist. You overestimate how well your forces will do. You underestimate how many you will need. And let's also not forget the power of chance or contingency, events that could not be predicted or controlled, individuals who could not be predicted, rising to the surface and changing the course of history. Would Munich have turned out differently if Hitler weren't there, if someone else were? These are the questions, but we need to be aware that these things cannot be predicted and often affect events dramatically. And also, war is initiated based on a perception of risks and benefits. From the outside, it can look like madness. But as a historian, and having been on the inside, albeit years removed, you start seeing the weighing that is going on when these decisions are being taken. Unless we're in that room at that time, from that world, it is very difficult to understand or to even come to the same calculation that those in power will take. But whether we understand or not is irrelevant, because whatever happens, when war begins, it means that the state has decided to achieve political objectives through military means. And then how it begins? Well, it begins like we're seeing right now, very high intensity, war of movement, very kinetic, high speed, many clashes, huge amount of destruction, huge loss of life. They begin like this. But after this initial phase, what happens? Well, there's a number of possibilities, and I'm generalizing a bit. I'll give you some examples. What can happen is one side can capitulate. This happened in the Six-Day War in 1967. Israel so rapidly overwhelmed its opponents that they surrendered very quickly. It happened just a few weeks ago in Nagorno-Karabakh. In one day, the Armenians began the withdrawal. And in France, 1940, after 6 weeks, French power was eliminated from World War II. Very, very quick. You overwhelm your opponent, they lose the desire to resist, and the war is over. If that doesn't happen, you overwhelm your opponent, but the desire to resist is there, you have an insurgency. The Soviets ran into this in 1979. After replacing the government in Kabul, they were faced with a decades-long insurgency in Afghanistan. The Americans ran into that in Iraq in 2003 and in Afghanistan, culminating in that tragic withdrawal 2 years ago. Now, we can debate whether or not the United States should have been there. That's an open question. But the way in which that withdrawal was performed reminded me of the footage I'd seen of Saigon in 1973. And if you want to go back, you can even go back to the Greek case, where Greece was occupied for 400 years, and yet the insurgency lasted for centuries, culminating in the War of Independence. When a people decide to resist, every act of repression, every act of violence and atrocity creates more revolutionaries. That is what these states experienced in a war of insurgency. If we don't go here, what's the third possibility? Well, neither side can achieve an immediate victory. You have a back and forth, and things start to settle down a bit, and the war becomes a war of attrition. And some examples here: World War I, of course, World War II, but also Iran-Iraq, 1980 to 88, a war of attrition. What does that mean? Because I also heard another myth. You can't win a war of attrition. And that just comes out of the statement, you don't really understand what attrition is. Attrition is this: you fight until the other side loses the will to continue, but you do so by outproducing them and destroying the other side's ability to produce weapons which can lead to victory. That is exactly what happened in World War I and II, where, especially in World War II, Germany and Japan just could not fight anymore. They were obliterated. Their capacity to make war was obliterated by the Allies. Their towns were destroyed. Their population was either killed or refugees. That's how those wars ended. Well, you can also have a war of attrition where there isn't this dramatic victory of one side over the other, but you have more or less of a stalemate, where neither side can quite get the upper hand. This happened in Korea, and it also happened with the Iran-Iraq war. What happens then? The war settles into a static phase. And in the case of Korea, an armistice was required, not a peace treaty. The war still exists. North Korea is still a problematic neighbor that carries out assassinations, that is disruptive in the region. And yet, with this armistice, South Korea has managed to find its way out of autocracy to democracy, to an open market, to be an incredible economy, an incredible success story out of what it went through. Because war is unimaginably consuming of people and objects. And we are fortunate where we live that we have forgotten this. But a couple stats I would like to just run by you here. Looking at the current conflict in Ukraine. Ukraine is being supported by roughly 1 billion people in the countries that are supporting it. And yet these states are running low on ammo after less than 2 years of war. Now, one specific example, on the Eastern Front during the Second World War, a tank would last 4 days, taking weeks to produce. So you invest weeks, and in 4 days that's gone. Now it's about 2 weeks, but the tanks take months to build. So this is a very difficult proposition. We have to understand how destructive. And when you're talking about supporting a country in war, what goes along with that? It's not just like I'm lending you my pencil. This is infinitely more complex, because with the tank has to go parts, has to go repair and maintenance bays. There have to go replacement. There have to go technicians to repair them. These are incredibly complex problems that need to be solved. You also have a demographic problem, because the average age of a soldier on the front line right now in Ukraine is over 40. We have a problem of data right now in this war from both sides, but that which we do know. And so that means we do have a demographic problem. When 40-year-olds make up the bulk of your fighting force, that means you have a problem. You have a demographic gap. And in terms of war supplies, well, NATO countries are running low on critical supplies of ammunition. These stories have been coming out more and more frequently over the last 6 months, but especially artillery. And member countries have not yet dramatically increased production. And one example, before I'll move on to the next section, that I'd like to leave you with, is that a Wall Street Journal article from last year stated that in 11 months, the Ukraine had used 13 years worth of Javelin missile production, and was taking $5 billion a month just to stay afloat. I am not saying this is worth it or not. I am saying this is what it is. This is the cost. This is why wars need to be avoided at all costs, because this is also, when these things get lost, that money is gone. The lives are gone. The buildings are gone. This is an unimaginably destructive event. And the war ends only when either one side has been totally defeated and can go on no more, Germany, Japan, or both sides are just exhausted and they need to find a way out, like Iran and Iraq. That's the de facto end, when the shooting stops. What's the de jure end? Well, there's a number of de jure ends. I'll give you a few examples here. Treaties. Versailles, ending World War I, the treaty with Germany. Paris in 1946, ending World War II. I put the London Agreement of 1953. Why? Well, this treaty came afterwards and was a way of reintegrating Germany into the Western market, preventing a Versailles-style situation from occurring, finding a way to treat Germany's status as the deadbeat of Europe, quote unquote, and to reintegrate and rehabilitate them and give them the tools to re-enter the market. The Treaty of San Francisco did the same thing with Japan in 1952, allowed it to rebuild and reintegrate. And the Paris Peace Accords, ending the Vietnam War. Though Vietnam and the United States had a problematic history for decades after that, now they are very close allies. How else can you end a war? Well, you can end it with a UN resolution. UN resolution, Security Council Resolution 598 ended the Iran-Iraq war. Both sides accepted the terms and the fighting stopped after 8 years. But for me, there's another way. It doesn't specifically end a war. But I mentioned these two treaties. Does anybody know what I'm referring to here? Right, I'm referring to the treaty, the foundation, the Treaty on European Union, Treaty of Rome, and the Washington Treaty that established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. These treaties, in my opinion, too, I'm going to talk about a little bit more, are very important in my estimation of preventing wars from occurring. Because I look at them both as alliances, countries that are trying to chart a new way forward. Because through these alliances, an international rules-based order has been established, as problematic, as corrupt at times they may seem, as flawed. Anything run by humans is going to have deep problems. But nonetheless, can we still look at these as a noble attempt to create some kind of structure to make the war, if not impossible, at least more difficult? We have the ICC now, we had the UN, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and many others. But these are symbolic of a new era of institution building that occurred in the wake of World War II. And it was a bit of a gift to rediscover these from the sacrifice of the Ukrainians. That we had to rediscover what these institutions and alliances meant and were worth. And I hope that this lasts, because we're entering, it seems to me, a new era. And I'd like to talk here about what my reflection as a historian can maybe give in terms of the peace treaties that have worked versus those that have not. I think we need to avoid Versailles-style treaties, as hard as it may be, and go for a London Agreement on German external debt style. And I'm going to clarify this a bit more in a moment. But treaties with, once the dust has settled, allow for both sides to move forward. And this is much easier said than done. I'm fully conscious of that. But let's at least have some kind of a roadmap of where we want to go. Because to finish here, I'd like to talk about this relationship between war and peace, and a few things to keep in mind. Because it's possible to win the war and win the peace. A perfect example is the US and the Allies after World War II, creating this globalized system of trade and a rules-based order in international relations. As cynical as you want to be about this, you can at least say that the United States benefited. But it's also possible to win the war and lose the peace. The Soviet Union after World War II, one of the victorious allies, and yet disintegrated. It lost the Cold War. And the US in Iraq and Afghanistan, unable to consolidate these incredible military victories that they achieved in very quick fashion at the beginning, and yet faced with these insurgencies culminating in the withdrawal from 2 years ago. And what about losing the war and winning the peace? The perfect examples here, Germany and Japan, where their power was transformed from irredentist or imperialistic to economic, where they were occupied and they were transformed and are now the countries that we know. So a few final words about this invasion. Where are we then? What does all of this mean? How is the war being fought? What is it about? Where do we stand, and what are some of the ifs and thens? Well, in my opinion, it is about Ukraine's place in the West. Does it have the right to chart its own path in international relations, as is outlined in the UN Charter? Well, that's the question. Now, the West's overall approach has been to punish and isolate Russia, to support the Ukraine, without having the conflict widen into a third world war. And at least where we stand now, it seems that nobody wants that. And what we see here is a transformation in the use of sanctions from a preventative measure, to a weapon. Sanctions on Russian oil and gas. And we see also a distinction between private sector sanctions and public sector sanctions. So governments banning imports of Russian oil and gas, but also private companies getting in and pulling their operations out of Russia. Now, the question is, have they worked? They certainly haven't worked to end the war. But they have affected Russia's ability to equip its troops, and Russia has found it increasingly difficult to acquire its replacements. But I've heard it described as a game of whack-a-mole, where you block the supply chain in one area and it pops up somewhere else. So this is a tool. And as for the Ukraine, well, they need to win the peace. Now, I'm speaking about something that is a long way off at this point. But how do they do that? And for me, the closest analogy that I can come here is with Korea, and that NATO and the EU will play an important role as the instruments through which this reconstruction then can take place. And which it may require bilateral or trilateral security guarantees. It may also require garrisons. Something will be there because Russia is not going away. You can't pick it up and move it to the other side of the planet. We need to find a way for them to live together. How that will occur? Well, I don't know. And so we come full circle to the question, can wars be prevented? And if anything happening over the last few days shows us, this is very difficult. Since states usually, or authorities, or those with armed forces, usually do all they can to convince others that they aren't planning to go to war because they want the element of surprise. It's very hard to predict when something like this would happen. The Israeli Defense Force got caught flat-footed. And even 2 years ago, all the news coming out of Russia, except for British and American intelligence, was saying he doesn't want to invade. He's just using this as a show. So it's very tough to prevent war. So the answer for me is yes and no. But I think the NATO and the EU alliances have shown that at least between members we can eliminate war, because I title my European integration course, European Integration, or How Europeans Stopped Killing Each Other Since 1945. So there is a way through alliances to do it. And these alliances which have produced the international legal and institutional framework through which these large interstate wars have been prevented since 1945. But the hardest part will be this. For this conflict, the two that are going on right now, creating a peace that does not embitter Russia towards the others, that will hold the individuals accountable, but eventually will find a way to reintegrate Russia, and it will be very difficult because, understandably, the Ukraine has every right to want payback and compensation. But we should not repeat the mistakes of Versailles. So, if we can do this while remaining united, then a lasting peace may be possible, but the future will tell. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. It was a great pleasure, and I look forward to the discussion and to Fleur's contribution as well. Thank you so much. Hi, Fleur. Nice to meet you.
Thank you so much, Simeon. Yeah, you can leave it on.
Leave it on?
That's going to be your mic. You can sit here. Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Fleur, welcome. For those who don't know you, let me introduce you. She's an expert in the field of conflict resolution and peace negotiation. Between 2008 and 2022, as a peace mediator, she conducted a dialogue with leaders of armed groups with the aim of reducing violence, including in Iraq and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Between 2009 and 2017, she was part of a team that negotiated the disarmament of armed groups in Northern Ireland and the Basque Country. She co-founded the Dialogue Advisory Group, with which she facilitates dialogues during armed conflicts all over the world. And in 2023, so very recently, she founded social enterprise Bureau Ontwapenend, which works on public conflict in the Netherlands and invests parts of its income in targeted and discrete international peace work. Fleur, welcome. Well, first of all, let's just address the elephant in the room. I know that the events from the last couple of days must be very hectic for you. I heard you on the radio this morning, on Radio 1. You were just in Hilversum at the talk sale, Galit and Sophie. So, yeah, just wanted to check in. How are you doing?
It's not on. Oh, yes. Here we go.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I could use a nap.
Okay.
And I also feel a little bit terrible saying that, having, I don't know, been immersed into what has been happening in Israel, Palestine.
Yeah.
So, but I'm good. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks
okay.
for having me.
Good. Yeah, maybe let's get into, for the audience as well, just get a little bit into the basics of peace mediation. How do you become a peace mediator?
Well, look, traditionally, mediation was a job that the UN did and powerful states. And that's one route. Mm-hmm. That was not my route. We founded an NGO. I was 25 at the time that we did that, and it was my co-founder's idea, and he is 20 years my senior. He's from Sri Lanka, where he advised the president in the peace process there, which is an interesting case when you think about wars ending. And I think I had the response that most people have when they hear about mediating an armed conflict from an NGO perspective, which was, I'm not sure what this is and how it's going to work. But it sounded intriguing. I knew I wanted to contribute something positively. And it was right when this kind of work became a little bit more prominent. And so...
And when was that?
So we started DOG in 2008.
2008, yeah.
Yeah, and that was also, I mean, there had been more NGOs doing this work, but that was around the time that it became more prominent. And so we kind of inadvertently rode that wave, and for me the rest was history. But if you want to get into this field, I'm not sure my example necessarily is the road, but there are many different roads, including diplomacy in your own country.
Yeah. So when are you deployed? I don't know if that's... somebody hire you? How does that work?
Yeah, so the how do you get work question is kind of tied up with the neutrality and impartiality question, in the sense that the money is coming from somewhere, and then the rule tends to be that the work comes from somewhere else. So the way that at DOG this is done is you have some core support from governments who invest in peace, for example, the Norwegians or the Swiss, and you use that core support to explore ideas that usually are brought to you from different places. We've had people higher up in the UN who had been stationed somewhere who saw something that they thought could be a peace dialogue, but that wasn't something that they could do for whatever reason. They were limited, and they happened to know that we existed, and so that's where the conversation started in one case. There are many variations on that theme, and I would say by and large, probably 90% of the time that an idea like that would come to us, we would end up exploring it and not pursuing it any further. And the remaining 10%, I think a lot was... turned out to be what we found turned out to be quite different than perhaps the initial idea. And we did end up doing 2 disarmaments, so sometimes the result is very concrete. But I also worked for over 10 years in Iraq, and yes, we brokered, sub-peace deals, but IS was also, then entered the scene and essentially didn't just undo a lot of the progress, but in a way made the conversation irrelevant because they were just surviving. So yeah, it's a range of different things.
Yeah, so you get a call, and then, so for example, in Iraq, so you go there, are you going on the ground and talking with different kinds of people, and then maybe one day you end up on a table with everyone together? Well, what are the first steps? How do you approach that?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a process. Usually an idea finds us, which I understand is a little bit counterintuitive because you're this small NGO in Amsterdam. How does this work? This field is quite small though, and at some point you start having some experiences, and the actors in these different conflicts have links. So from that perspective, I suppose it makes some sense. And then the process you were asking is, I mean, I want to say it varies, and it does, but there is, once that question comes in, a kind of like a research process starts where usually the person who suggests the idea has contacts in this place. They tend to be more connected to one side than the other. We need to make an assessment initially whether we think that's an issue, whether it fits within what we ended up calling our niche. So we worked a lot with extremist groups that others didn't talk to. And we talked a lot about subjects that others wouldn't talk about. And then we also did to disarmament, which is quite a specific type of activity. And so there were certain factors that we would take into account where we did the initial research as to whether we thought it was feasible and it fit within our niche. That did also include, obviously, a lot of conversations with analysts, people we trust, people who we know there, as well as going there. And then we would have a kind of, it wasn't always as structured as I'm putting it now, but we would have an internal conversation where we said, okay, this is what we found initially, this is how it's different from what we thought we would find, this is how it might fit with what we do, and what does that now mean given our current capacity? And also very sort of real things. It's a little bit cynical, but there is more interest to fund a certain work in certain places than there is in other places. So depending on, as an NGO, where you are with that, you need to make an assessment as to whether you can actually do what you would intend to do. And then from there you start more of like an intense actual project phase where you go to the place more often, you make contact with the different sides, you try to figure out if people are willing to come to the table, if there's somebody missing from the table. You usually have these proxy forces in armed conflict, and there's a question of, usually it's not spoken, but there needs to be a link. So there are a lot of different elements that you explore. And slowly but surely, usually you find out that perhaps it isn't as promising as you had hoped, or perhaps it doesn't fit as well with what you do. And then sometimes you progress to the next step and you start devising, kind of doing a process design where you have sequences of dialogue, the different parties at the table, to the extent that they're willing to talk to each other, as well as individual conversations about certain agenda topics. I don't make that up. They do that, obviously. A central tenet of this is that if the parties are unwilling to be at the table, then you have no table.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of a bit of an overview.
Yeah, it's very general, I understand. So you talked about treaties, so I imagine, and like NATO and UN, so big organizations who also, play a role in peacemaking or keeping the peace. How does that compare to the work that you do?
I think the work that I do, but I'd love to hear your perspective, is a lot less structured than that. And I think, I'm not always sure this is true, but some people in our organization would always say the less you write down in certain stages, the better. But at some stage, you have to become concrete and have an agreement. So I don't know if that answers your question or how you see that difference.
No, look, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the treaties I cited, we must understand, are the end of a very long process. And every word in these things has been argued and fought over before it makes it into that final group in which then the signature is there. So all of what Fleur just said is absolutely common, even in, I don't use this in terms, I don't want to diminish anything saying a bigger conflict, but if World War II, well, There were many backroom and casual conversations done over coffee in the hallway before a certain clause was put in or removed. So there is definitely that informal aspect well in advance. And that's why often as a historian as well, a lawyer will look at the treaty and then they'll argue over whether you interpret it correctly or not. Historians won't do that as much. We'll look in the annexes, we'll look in the deliberations or memoirs to find out, well, what was intended before you get to that point. So I think it lines up perfectly.
Yeah, so you mentioned bigger conflicts. I didn't want to assume that your conflicts are small or anything, but also I was also thinking about that, like some conflicts are more well known and are bigger. Is that the kind of stuff they're going to call you in as well, or is that something that's been done higher up? I don't know if...
Yeah, I mean, there are exceptions, but by and large, sort of the more hot conflicts, so I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, small or large, obviously there's also scale to it, but at times where it's very intense. So for example, with Israel-Palestine now, we're looking at major military activity. That isn't necessarily a time where they want to be having a dialogue with an unofficial actor like us. There are times when we do, for example, the work that we did in Basque Country, I think was a little bit unexpected that a group like ours would do that job, which was very much contextually determined. But again, the conflict was definitely not hot at that point. So I think that distinction for sure is relevant.
So the hotter the conflict, the less likely they're going to call a party like yours.
Yeah, I mean, for example, in Ukraine, not us, but another, I say us, but I have left them, not them, but another organization that does this kind of work, they were involved in the grain deal. So it doesn't mean that there can't be any involvement, but it usually isn't right at the center because there are huge strategic, geopolitical interests tied up with that. And so therefore, also sometimes it's very helpful to have a mediating party that has some power to push on things, which we don't. So I do think it's a different animal. It can be a complementary animal.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think I'm thinking about, should we talk about Ukraine and Russia, or should we talk about the hot conflict right now? But I'm going to go with the last one. So you're being interviewed a lot. So what is the main thing that people want to know? Because you're not involved in this hot conflict, but what is the general knowledge that people really like to get from you at this point?
I think there are different elements. One is understanding the current situation and getting us some kind of a sense of what that means, and potentially even, I feel like we're not doing enough forward-looking, and I don't mean predicting what's going to happen next necessarily, but the risk of escalation in the current situation beyond how bad it already is. So I'm talking Hezbollah, I'm talking whoever sponsors Hezbollah, other involvement, regional involvement, is huge. And so I think that conversation about what can constructively be done, not to escalate it rhetorically, is really important. And I think that was also something in the Ukraine war that you can support with weapons. That's a decision that you make as the West in this case or not. And then you make a decision about how you speak about it. And I think that rhetorical decision is really important in terms of not being too inflammatory. Anyway, I'm kind of sidetracking your question. So I think the current situation, understanding what's going on and what it means, how it's different from other times that this conflict has escalated, what the potential impact can be, and also for me specifically, what the prospects might be for any mediated effort, and then specifically also connected to the hostages, which is a very specific element to this situation and this conflict.
Yeah, so let's unpack this a little bit. When you say we're not looking forward, who is we?
Well, I think, at least the conversations that I'm having with, not necessarily with analysts. I think in those spaces there is more forward-looking, and I'm sure and I hope within ministries as well. But I think in the news, it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, it's today's news. But also, so that's kind of the space that I mean. I think in the conversations that I've been having with journalists, I feel there's a lot of emphasis on what's going on right now, which makes sense because it's moving so quickly and it's so new and there's a lot to understand. So it wasn't necessarily a criticism. I think that makes sense.
No.
And I would like to I don't know, try and be as constructive as possible so as not to inflame it further and think, what can the media do around that? What can whatever different governments do around that?
So that's also about the public conversation that is happening right now. Is that something that you also found striking about today's conversation about what's happening?
Well, certainly, look, in that sense, I can go back to my work as a historian, where it's much easier because I'm dealing with documents. They're not going anywhere. They've been produced. The people that wrote them are dead. So the pressure isn't there. It's not the same. I have reflection time on what I'm reading, and I have the benefit of context and hindsight. We don't have that right now because things are happening so fast, and we're in an age where you have a very powerful computer in the palm of your hand and the information comes. So it's very difficult to not only process that, but remove yourself from that. So it's a very difficult situation. I think in that sense, my job is much easier than Fleur's on a professional level, you know. And so as a historian, this is too frequent for me to touch. It's very hard to comment on. The best that I can do is I save bits of information or articles that I think may be interesting to give some context later when things calm down. But other than that, no, it's just to try and, you know, I react as a human being, and it's just so horrendous. And the only thing I would say in addition is, if these things don't stop, I do know where they tend to go.
Yeah. So is that also the escalation that Fleur is talking about, that we should be more mindful of that?
Yeah, I mean, we're very early days, so it's too early to tell. But certainly, with what's going on in the world and the way things have changed over the last 3 years, there's a shift going on. And it's too early to see which way it will go, but I have this feeling that we're in another dramatic earth-changing moment. Now, how that goes, I have no idea. I mean, no one really could have predicted what happened throughout the Cold War in 1945. But things are happening, and it's just really important as well, I think, to protect ourselves from all of this and too much information, to understand what we can control and to be responsible with where we access the information and what we say about it, and try and take a bit of time. That's the best I can do.
Could I ask something? So my academic career was around when everybody was obsessed with Fukuyama and the end of history.
Yes, yeah.
So I guess when you say...
Talk about timing.
I know. So I guess when you say, in a way what you're saying is perhaps we're seeing a new era dawn. I know I'm asking you a really difficult question, but could you elaborate a little bit on what you think some of the signs and the shifts are that give you that sense?
Well, the United States is in an inflection point in terms of its role internationally. They're reevaluating about, are they going to police the oceans? Are they going to protect global trade? That's an open question. With the debt burden that they have, these are very profound questions going on right now in the Congress with the next US president. I'm Canadian. I lived next to this elephant my whole life, you know, and when they sneeze, we caught a cold. You know, so you learn to pay attention to what the US is doing. But they are in an inflection point. This role that they assumed after World War II, well, it's going to transform, I think. And what's happening in China is also interesting. I mean, she has purged that government. So it's his show. And it's such a huge country, it's such a huge economy, who knows where that goes? Can one person control it? Very difficult proposition. But in any case, so the best that I feel comfortable saying is I see a lot of things, though, transforming. How they go, I wouldn't want to speculate. We're very fortunate where we live. I will say that.
And can I ask one more follow-up question?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Is there, sort of with that 2020 hindsight, are there some common denominators that you see looking back when such shifts occur? In terms of course, we don't know what this is going to look like, but do we know what it's going to mean?
Well, after World War I, a number of empires disappeared off the map. That wasn't predicted. The Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire disappeared. After World War II, the Japanese Empire disappeared. And like I said in the lecture, let's reflect on this. Japanese and German power were transformed. That's really significant. That altered the course of European history. It altered the course of Japanese history, but also Chinese history. Because the opening of China occurred as the Chinese, Deng Xiaoping, is looking across the ocean and saying, wow, look at what Japan has become. Maybe there's something that we can do. And that was the beginning of the opening of China, really to the US market and to these trade links that we've become so accustomed to. But if you asked the people at the time, could they predict that? No. And even 1938, did they predict World War II? No, they hoped. Chamberlain came back, peace in our time. That's why historicism is so important when we're trying to understand the past. And historicism is not about agreeing. It's about trying to recreate the world as it existed then to understand why they took these decisions. So, again, I'm not sure if that's the answer you were hoping for. That's the best I feel that I can do, though. Does that help at all? Did that?
Yeah, no thanks. And I think I'm kind of asking it from over these past days and over the past period. I think I've been in contact with so many people who are afraid because they feel, anyway, because so much violence is happening around them, but also I think because we all feel the ground shifting under our feet, and I'm kind of grasping at what that might mean. And obviously there's no answer, but those kinds of historical, I don't know, lessons, I suppose, hopefully help. So thank you.
Yeah, well, look, you're welcome. I mean, for whatever comfort it may afford, I don't say this lightly. We're very fortunate. Most of the world does not live in conditions that we enjoy on a day-to-day basis. So we should not take that for granted. And whatever comfort, that should be a great deal of comfort in these uncertain times. And not to do what we can to share that as well. It's not easy. I think you do much more in that regard than I do. So it's really wonderful what you try to do. But let's be eyes open. There's a hard work that's coming, if it's not here already.
I think it's time to also look at you people, and if you have any questions, and see what they'd like to see discussed. I see the gentleman here in the front.
Yeah, I have a remark that there's very different, what you said about Versailles. Ukraine is entitled to compensation, but we should not have a Versailles type of thing. But there is an extremely big difference between Germany and Russia with all the natural resources in Siberia. If you give them enough time, they can easily pay enormous sums. So that's a remark. And the question is, why, given what you said with how our war ends, why isn't the ammunition production up significantly in these countries with these 1 billion people?
Yeah.
Why is that? I don't understand it.
Yeah, no, those are two excellent points. I'll address the first one. I'm not that certain that Russian oil and gas is coming back, because those resources have been maintained with Western experts and Western companies. And when I talked about private sanctions, things like companies like BP have pulled out, and so all of their tech, all of their knowledge and their engineers are gone. So it's an open question if that energy ever makes it back to market. I don't know. It took 30 years to open them the last time, because they'll freeze. So if they freeze again, the pipes burst, they all have to be replaced. We're talking about thousands of kilometers of pipe. I'm not an engineer, I'm reading what the engineers have said, so I don't know. It is an important point. They are very rich in natural resources, of course, so you're absolutely correct. But it's too far off to predict how easy it will be for them to do that. And sorry, the next point. Yeah, and that's, well, you have to sell that to your domestic populations, because interest rates everywhere have started going up, and there's less disposable income. Our economies are reeling still after COVID, and now this recent shock, and arms production is very expensive, because you're spending a lot of money, and you're not getting that back. You get some jobs, but it's also not a matter of just producing more shells, but you may have to build more factories, and there's not a huge incentive for private sector to do that unless they know there's going to be contracts coming 5 or 10 years down the road. So there is a lot of domestic politics in every country of the NATO alliance that are coming into play here. And most of our countries, let's face it, are pacifist countries that are adverse to spending on the military. So there's a lot, it's almost a perfect storm, and we're using stockpiles that have been here for decades. And now those are gone, or almost. I know in the case of Canada, the Canadian military right now has 10 days worth of shells, where NATO standards are 30. And they haven't increased production. So why? Call your representative in Parliament. Yeah, I've written letters to mine.
Anyone else? in the back.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the lecture and the talk. In certain media circles, you hear some sort of lament, I guess, that there was a missed opportunity of rapprochement with Russia in the beginning of the 2000s, and that, in a way, the West is to blame for what's happening now. What is your comment on that?
Yeah, I think that the evidence that is firmly against that. There's a series of agreements and treaties dating back to the Soviet period about integrating Russia and the Soviet Union. The Helsinki Final Act of 1975 to integrate Russia more and to mutually support each other's people's rights to self-determination and recognizing each other's borders. 1991 Charter of Paris for New Europe, where there's a recognition of the borders that they exist and a pledge to integrate Russia. The 1997 Russia-NATO Founding Act, where they agree that we're not enemies, we'll support each other. Then there's the billions of dollars that the United States sent to Gorbachev to prevent the Soviet Union from disintegrating in 1990-91. Because they didn't want to be dealing with 15 republics. They wanted to deal with the Soviet Union to keep that nuclear arsenal under control, to keep a big state afloat. Billions and billions of dollars, many of which have been lost. And then Germany voluntarily submitting itself and taking more and more and more Russian gas over and over and over. So for me, the charge that NATO is to blame, or that the West is to blame, or there's this missed opportunity, look, there were these olive branches, it's not enough. Because also, the Soviet Union and Russia have pledged time and time again to respect territorial integrity. Now, let's not be naive. The United States has violated many times countries' integrity. The best example I can think of is Iraq. Yes. But, I mean, how far back do we want to go? Because when I look at it, all I see, predating the collapse of the Soviet Union, but continuing up to the present, are attempt after attempt to integrate Russia further and further to prevent this from happening. So I reject that. I think NATO, sure, it played a part, but is Russian expansion something new in history that it started only once NATO was on the board? No. So I have a hard time accepting that as a justification for the war. That's my short answer.
Fleur, what's your take on the metaphorical olive branches that Simeon is talking about?
Well, look, I think far be it for me to disagree. The one thing that I would say is when the Georgia invasion happened, you know, we didn't perhaps take it as seriously as we should have. So certainly that's not justification, or it doesn't change anything in terms of where you might want to place responsibility, but I do think that element of, you know, perhaps not wanting to see it for what it is, or whatever it was, you know, that wasn't great.
No, look, that's a great point. And look, I'm not trying to say that everything that the West has done is good or smart. No. That was a terrible missed opportunity to confront somebody, just like 2014 when the Crimea was seized. But if we want to talk about olive branches, after the September 11th terror attacks occurred, the first person to reach President Bush was Vladimir Putin. And he said, "What can I do to help?" And many people point to that as that was the missed opportunity. And he said, you know, what can we do? We're here. What do you need? And the Russians came through, and they actually gave some logistical support to the United States in their attack on Afghanistan. But what isn't as widely known is there was something else that Putin asked in return for that help. And he asked for a free hand in Eastern Europe. And George Bush said, that is not my gift to give. So say what you will about Bush. We can all have great, colorful opinions. But in that moment, was he not correct? Was it his right? Was it the right of the United States and Russia to dictate the course of Eastern Europe? So certainly there have been mistakes. That's an excellent one that you raised. But I mean, we also need to be frank about what the history tells us and shows about true motivations.
Would you say that in international politics, a favor always requires a favor?
Yeah, but what's that favor?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is it your right or your power to give? And in terms of NATO expansion, I mean, Putin has been very open. He asked for a rollback of NATO to its 1991 frontier. Who's going to be the one to go to Poland and tell them that?
Yeah.
Or to the Czech Republic? Countries that have transformed themselves to try and get into that alliance.
But should we always be at our tiptoes whenever somebody says, I will give you a favor, that you also have to give something back? Is there never any favors just for the sake of it? Like,
Well, look, I would say we're moving away from cooperation. And that also means that there's a lot more real politics. Obviously, there always was. But it's not, yeah, it's moving away from that. So definitely that's an element. But the thing is, this is probably, the people who worry about that know that very well. But that probably doesn't always play out in everybody's interest.
okay. Yeah, I see a question here on the left. Oh, you can sit down.
So I was wondering, I grew up somewhere close to the border between Germany and Poland, and so what I understood is there's a symbolic first visit from the German Chancellor to Poland to formally acknowledge again that that is the border between Germany and Poland. And I was wondering, I see this as a symbolic act, and I totally believe that that is exactly what the German Chancellor wants to do at that moment, to firmly reconfirm. Yeah. I wonder, is a border a Western concept? Do we respect, like, what makes a border? And is that different in sort of how I grew up versus how people grow up in what we don't consider the West? That's the question.
Well, so my immediate thought when you say that goes to all the artificial straight lines on maps that we drew. And so there's a huge colonial, post-colonial element in that question, and I feel perhaps it's not my place to answer what other people's experiences with that are, but from a distance, it definitely has not been very constructive. And thank you for sharing your experiences. It's really interesting to hear.
Yeah, and I might just add, certainly borders are an incredible source of violence. Fights over borders have provoked a number of conflicts that I could name off the top of my head. So certainly, they're a modern concept as well. My wife's family was used to transitioning with the shepherds over the hills, traditionally. And borders were imposed after World War II, and all of a sudden half the family was cut off in one area, and the other half was cut off somewhere else. So that's certainly, and also, well, I'll talk about straight lines. In World War I, a French general saw a little curve in the line that he didn't like very much, said this should be straight. It turned into the Battle of the Somme, where 200,000 died, just trying to straighten that line. So yes, we need to be careful where these lines are and how we draw them. Yeah.
I have a question about the peace process, about the pressure from external pressure. If there are two parties which are small, then it seems to be easy because you have a large nation like the America or the USSR who can put pressure, or China can put pressure. But if there's a big country involved, what kind of pressure you can give? Like in the case of Russia, Ukraine, who is big enough to put pressure on Russia? So how does that work in the past? And now, what do you expect? What are the possibilities for the table?
Look, the problem that those at a much higher level than myself have is that Russia has certain capabilities that other states may not. All right. Now, whether or not these capabilities are used or deployed is another question, because a historian that I greatly admire has issued the following equation that he came up with. He said, Ukrainian valor combined with Russian atrocities equals Western unity and resolve. So when a school is bombed, more weapons go. Germany reinvents its policy towards Russia because a hospital was destroyed, and so on and so forth. So Russia has put itself in a very difficult position. There's no real way for them to win the peace at this point. That being said, you're exactly right. How do you apply pressure to a nuclear-armed state? So that pressure, from the analysts that I trust, needs to come from within. And we're not seeing a lot of that yet. There are rumblings against the government. We saw what Prigozhin did a few months ago. But this is really uncharted territory. And I think thus far the West approach has been wise, saying we do not want a direct conflict with Russia, but every inch of NATO soil will be defended, and until at least the presidential elections in the US next year, Ukraine will continue to be supported. But beyond that, this is a difficult situation. I don't have anything better for you.
Fleur, anything to add? Is it correct that the gentleman said that 2 smaller states on the table is easier to come to peace?
I think it's impossible to make those generalizations. I think in this case, the Russia angle is, what I find really interesting is that I am in a certain kind of bubble, but when I speak to people from there, their experience about the pressure and the potential way forward was quite striking to me, because I think from the outside looking in, I share your view. It's this giant with a red button, right? So what do you do in the face of that? But I think from within, the reality is that there has been a lot of pressure, which has caused some fraying at the edges, which I'm not necessarily, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, it's not necessarily likely that something better will emerge.
That's important.
So, yeah, it's also a bit
Very
careful
important.
what you wish for.
Yeah. Well, the criticism that is being lobbied, the fraying around the edges, what we can get are from groups right of President Putin on the political spectrum. So just think about that for a moment. There's no guarantee exactly that if he's replaced, he'll be replaced with someone who is necessarily more focused on achieving peace. Right? So this is very, very, 50 years from now will be fascinating. Okay? Fascinating. We live through this. And I believe we will live through this. All right? There's no button that he can push that doesn't immediately trigger a button on him. And American intelligence has communicated to him that they know exactly where he is all the time. So at least tonight you should all sleep a little bit easier.
I think it's also good maybe to look at some more positive examples that actually led to peace or a successful mediation/negotiation. What are the ingredients for a successful mediation/negotiation?
I think a lot of it is being ready when it shifts. So in a successful peace process, I think you can't always know, obviously you never know what's going to happen, but you can make decisions in the moment that will not burn bridges too significantly, that focus on relationships, that also push the envelope a little bit. And I think in that way, my experience has been, you can make the difference when it shifts. You can't necessarily create the shift. So I would say that's in my view, that's important.
And can you give an example of such a shift? Is that something that a certain actor does, or is it more like a geopolitical event happening?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a big geopolitical event, but I'm thinking of an example that I won't get too specific, but we had a major breakthrough because we were working with an armed group, and there was the likelihood that there would be a political shift and towards a more conservative party, which would try to arrest them, this armed group, more try to get at their weapons, their arsenal. And so that changed the calculations that they made in terms of how willing they were to take next steps towards peace. And I think, although they were also saying different things, that in the end, that's what pushed them to take the step. But then you still have to, in another example, we also had that same situation. There was a group that said, look, we want to disarm, but these are some of our red lines. And that's where you really get into the negotiation process, where you need to figure out if there are creative options to meet those red lines, if there are pressure points from outside power or whatever it is, to finally get to the finish line.
Yeah, so because you talked about calculations as well when it comes to starting a war, so how do you get into the nitty-gritty of the calculations of the actors on the table? Is that the research you talked about, or how do you try to get into their head and see what motivates them, or do?
Well, I thought that was really interesting that you said that, because I think sometimes there's also so much emotion and so much, with 2020 hindsight, decisions that are made towards or away from war that probably weren't rational or as thought through. I like to think about it in that way, and I think with 2020 hindsight, you can really pull that apart nicely and try to understand what happened when. And sometimes, I guess we were saying that earlier as well, like in the moment, I don't always have confidence that that's what drives us to make these major decisions. So I guess to take it back to the peace process part, for me, it's very much about the psychology of what's going on at the table, and obviously the external reality that limits what is possible there, and it's very much alive. And I find that it can be a little bit discombobulating how quickly things shift and what that means. You just have to be on your toes at all time.
So are you saying that you think that emotions play a bigger part in war and peace than maybe you discussed?
Well, I mean, I don't know that. I think they are two complementary perspectives, because I think, I've seen many governments function, obviously at this level, you make a calculation, and then also something happens and there's a visceral response, and sometimes that's the trigger point. So I think they come together.
Yeah, I think, look, it's an excellent description of what I see in my research. And the emotion is very strong, especially when the war has been joined and then it becomes a total war. And you've invested your society into it. Well, then it's really hard to stop, because emotions are there. You've convinced your population this has to happen. How do you pull back from that and tell them, I'm sorry, 200,000 have died, the numbers go and go and go. It's very, very difficult. And if I could pull from history again, World War I is a little bit different. You would see the Allies interested in peace, but the Germany and their allies were not. And then when Germany and their allies would be interested in talking, the allies weren't. But there was this interest. Well, World War II, no. They insisted on unconditional surrender. There was definite emotion on the Allied side with that decision, showing what the end point would be. So we cannot discount the importance of emotion.
Yeah. So there are actually two questions online that pertain to exhausted parties. Can negotiation or mediation be a force of its own, or do both sides in a conflict first have to be exhausted?
Yeah, so sort of the conventional wisdom is that you need to be in a mutually hurting stalemate situation, meaning that both or all parties are in a situation that is painful to them and that they want to get out of, and that's a moment where essentially the situation is more ripe for peace negotiations. I think that's a general view, like that would be ideal. I've seen many where there was a big power asymmetry. One side was more in pain than the other, and you kind of work with what you have. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of both.
Okay. I see a very interesting question as well from online. In times of conflict, who speaks on behalf of the environment? What do you think about the inclusion of ecocide as an international crime? because I also, when I see all the bombings in Gaza, and then I think about all the debris that gets spewed into the air and the trees that are falling down, and I get that there's a lot more human suffering, but I also can't shake that. So I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, look, we live on this planet. I mean, we were part of it, and the air and the water. I mean, let me state the obvious. We evolved here, and this is our place in the universe. When I see the photos of, well, I can look at Nanking from the 1930s, and those things horrify me. So it's not as visceral a response for me personally. But
because you're used to it, you mean?
No, I'm sorry, because for me, the human cost is far outweighs the immediate environmental, because, I mean, I can replant a tree, I can't recreate a child. I mean, let's be frank. But there is an incredible cost here, and I read a paper that was heartbreaking, that there are still fields in France that cannot be used for cultivation because of the destruction of the water table from the bombing in the First World War, or that are polluted from the chemicals that still cannot be used. Ukraine was an incredible food producer for the world. Egypt got most of its grain from Ukraine. Those fields, if they are not polluted by the shells and all the terrible toxic components, they may not have the water supply left because the water table has been so destroyed. So for me, there could be, but also we need to be realistic. It took the ICC, 98, the Rome Statute was signed. They agreed on genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. It took them 20 years to decide that they were going to punish aggression, launching an aggressive war. So ecocide, does it have a place? For sure, add it to the list of charges. But let's be realistic about when this could occur, and is that really the priority? I mean, it's incredibly important, but we need to stop humans killing each other.
Is that also something that actors take into account, the destruction of land or like production fields?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, I've worked on reparations.
Yeah.
And it does come in the reparation now. For example, Poland is still angry that they didn't receive reparations from Germany. And part of it goes into the destruction of property and fields. So there are compensation claims still on the books for these things. There's no easy solution. And Germany is a willing participant, or is a partner in Europe, and it's a difficult task to achieve. But it is part of reparations. Yeah.
Anything to add?
Well, I think we're seeing a clear human cost to the way that we are destroying the planet, and that should have a place in those conversations. And a lot of the places where armed conflict is, are also the places that are already immediately feeling the impact of us destroying the planet. I'm thinking of the Horn, where you've had unprecedented droughts that make, that cause migration within the region, that interact with the conflict. I'm thinking about Israel-Palestine, where obviously water with Egypt is a huge driver of the conflicts and resource that is being fought over. So I think sometimes it's very concretely present, which kind of goes back to your earlier point, because it's very much connected to real politics. Mm-hmm. Whereas I don't know, but it sounds like what this person is asking, or maybe what you're saying is, don't we need to do a little bit more than that, given what's happening? And I think the answer is yes, and I think we don't do that. Even though we know what needs to be done, we don't do that enough, and that is painful to sit in.
Anyone else? A question? Let me see. Guy in the front.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation and discussion. I have maybe more fundamental question about the peace negotiation. If I hear like conflict, I immediately have to think about, okay, well, how to solve a conflict. I'm studying to become a teacher, and if I look at the conflict between children, it's about needs, and it's about listening to each other's needs, and what does this kid need, and that they talk about it with each other. So when I hear this, I'm thinking, okay, of course it's a much more complex scale, but should we not in peace negotiation think about how can we drop our shields and listen to each other? Is this not the question, like how to listen to each other and how to drop shields in order to solve a conflict?
Yeah, I think a lot of the dynamics that you're describing are also at play at the table, at least with the individuals present. Now there's the question of, how does that interact with their constituency, all of this jazz, but you're still dealing with the dynamic at the table. And what I would find is a specific example in the Middle East where we had an area that needed to be liberated from the Islamic State. And there was a person there, a sheikh, who had been displaced from that area. And they were very disenfranchised. They belonged to a similar sect as Islamic State. And they didn't have any arms, nobody to fight for them. And they were very afraid. And that, that the liberation would go wrong, that the people who would liberate didn't have their best interests at heart, that their area, which was very important to them, would be destroyed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also, they were afraid to say that. And there was also a pride element involved in saying, I am powerless in the face of this, and you're not, it's very difficult to be asking something of this party who, because the others at the table, they had been at war as well. And so I think all of those things are present in that conversation. And yet it's really difficult to get it in the conversation at the table. And so oftentimes, which was also the case here, we have these side conversations, which is really where a lot of that difficult work happens. And in this case, this man was somehow able to voice what was going on in the middle of this freaking tornado, which I was very, that's difficult and painful. And somehow we found a way to bring that into the conversation that was a lot more neutral. We had an analyst who had studied other areas that had been liberated, and there were certain things that went wrong and certain things that went well that kind of lined up with what the sheikh's concerns were. So we had the analyst make that presentation kind of geared in that direction without the sheikh having to say those things. That kind of came to mind when you said that, and I think I'm really grateful that it worked in that specific instance, and I think there are many instances where you don't get to that point because it is so challenging and painful, but you try, and they try.
Okay. Yeah, with almost the end of the evening coming in sight, I was just thinking maybe you can both give one takeaway message for people in the audience right now that maybe they should think about when they read about war and peace or see something on the news. What is something you would advise the people to keep in mind or to think about?
Wow, only that?
Yes. Your 1 minute.
Wow.
No.
Oh, man. So do I go first, or do I let you go first, Fleur? Look, I don't know. This will pass. If anything, as a historian, humanity has a long history behind it. I hope we have a long history in front of us. I hope we're not so stupid that we find a way to annihilate ourselves. I don't think that that's on the table in the immediate future. There are a lot of things we need to worry about, but succeeding generations will succeed because succeeding generations have succeeded before. Doesn't mean it will be easy. Let's be open about the challenges that are in front of us, but let's not be afraid. I would be afraid going back in time and living 100 years ago. That terrifies me. I wouldn't make it. So these things are coming, but let's face it, open-eyed, with as clear a head as we can, and take a deep breath and be calm as we can be. That's what I've got.
Great, thank you, Simeon. Fleur, any...
It's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Glad I went first. I'm glad I went first.
What I would say is that, look, I spend a lot of time in places where I wasn't from, that were very different from where I was from. And what struck me was that there existed whole narratives and perspectives and universes that I sort of knew were there, but didn't really grasp or wasn't aware of. Or even small things like, I'm from the Netherlands. I would spend a lot of time in Iraq. Here, we look at Turkey as, you know, not being in the West, and there is tension there. There, Turkey for me was one of my most recognized sort of powers. And so I think that notion of what you see depends very much on where you are and who you have around you. And I think having that awareness and having some grace for yourself and for the other, and trying to curiously figure out where they're coming from when they see things so differently, rather than disagreeing. Specifically in Israel, Palestine, if you are exposed to Arabic-speaking media, the image that you get is painful to such a degree that we never see the tip of that iceberg. And I'm not sort of taking a side, but I think exploring that a little bit and trying to have those worlds meet is something that we can all do. So I guess that's what I
So
say.
be calm and look at conflicts or situations from different sides. I think that's a great takeaway message. Before we go to the last round of applause for our guests today, I do want to ask you if you can scan this code and take a little bit of time to fill in our survey and let us know what do you think of tonight. And I also want to mention that we will be back with this series on November 7th. And then we have a guest, which is Professor Lea Ipi from the London School of Economics. And when a conflict ends, many questions often remain unanswered. Is figuring out the truth always necessary to move forward? How to deal with historical injustice on a personal and collective level? And Dr. Lea Ipi draws on her own family history in post-war communist Albania to examine how dignity, truth, and reconciliation are connected. So if you are interested in a more post-conflict view of the world, then I hope to see you on November 7th. I wish you a great evening, and one last round of applause for our guest, Dr. Simeon Paravantes, Fleur Ravensbergen.